Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Today I wanted to go over a Stamina Warden build. This video will be a little shorter than a lot of my guides. I won't be doing a deep dive into the Warden class in general, and instead I'll be doing something a little different and covering a build from Avail that he posted in the ESO University Discord. So thank you very much, Avail, for letting me share this. And if you aren't already a member of that Discord, I always have it linked in the description of my videos. Definitely recommend joining if you want to learn more about ESO. So what all will we cover in this video? I'll go through an overview of the build and why it works well. We'll cover the top races, our Mundus stone, the food, drinks, and potions we'll be using, our champion points, the gear setup, our skill bars, a couple of combat rotations, including both an easier static and an advanced static rotation, and then we'll end with a couple of clips of this build in action from Avail on the trial dummy. If you do like the content here and you aren't already subscribed to the channel, doing so is free and really helps me out a ton, and you can always change your mind later. With that out of the way, let's get into it. So one reason I wanted to cover this build in particular is because it uses a bit of a unique gear loadout compared to what you would normally see on other stamina classes. Avail was the first one I saw in the Deadlands DLC doing some really high-end DPS testing with the set Drozakar's Claws. This is one of those sets I've always been intrigued by, and every now and then I'll go back and test it, and it's usually been a pretty solid set overall, but typically it would be outranked by some of the more meta options for whatever patch it was that I had looked at it. Well, this DLC with the Deadlands on the Stamina Warden in particular, it's absolutely fantastic. So the way the 5-piece bonus works is that for every bleed effect you have on the enemy, increase your weapon and spell damage by 103 against them. And Wardens work especially well with this set because they have two unique class bleeds, Growing Swarm, and then also the secondary bleed effect from the Cutting Dive ability. So while other classes could make use of this set through the skills from the weapon and guild skill lines, Wardens have a bit of an advantage to take it a couple of steps further. So that 103 weapon and spell damage on the 5-piece would assume 100% uptime on a particular bleed effect, which is generally not realistic, but even with less than perfect uptimes, the average weapon and spell damage we get from this set is really high and the ceiling is even higher. So Avail put together this nice chart here showing the uptimes for each of the bleed effects that he had on his parse and then what that would average out to. So we still end up with a 5-piece bonus of 803 weapon and spell damage, even after accounting for downtimes with skills, which is pretty insane. And as a ceiling, while we have every bleed active at once, we are all the way up to 953 weapon and spell damage, so pretty crazy stats overall. But I think that about covers the overview, so let's get into the rest of the build. For our top race options, we have Dark Elf, Orc, and Khajiit. I think Dark Elf would probably be my favorite out of those three from a pure damage perspective. For our Mundus stone, we'll be going with the Thief. There are some instances where I might go with the Lover here if I know I'm going to be in a group that's really not optimizing for penetration and I'm going to end up really under the pin cap. I might go with the Lover for that run just so I don't have to switch up too many things in my build. Just switch that out and then I should be good to go on pin for the run. Then for our food, if you can sustain it, the Bistat health plus stamina option is the best since it gives us great damage and a large health pool. But if you need a lot of sustain and you don't mind being a little squishier, you can run the Lava Foot food as well. This gives us stamina and recovery. This is definitely what I'd recommend for practicing on the trial dummy. And then for a little less damage than those other two options, but a nice middle ground when it comes to health and sustain, you can go with Artaeum Takeaway Broth or Dubious Camoran Throne. Artaeum does have slightly better stats of these two, but it is more expensive. For our potions, we are going with the standard weapon power potions that give major brutality, major savagery, and stamina return. If you want to run some cheaper potions, just make sure you are keeping up your Bullnetch 100% of the time for the major brutality buff, and have something like Camo Hunter slotted on your front bar for the major savagery. This might mean moving some skills around a little bit, but maybe worth it to you for some easier content that doesn't warrant using the good potions. The Warden skill Green Lotus will also give that savagery buff if you wanted to slot it for that, but typically the heal is not needed in group content if you have a healer already. For our champion points, typically we'll be wanting to slot Backstabber, Master at Arms, Deadly Aim, and Thaumaturge. There could be times when you can't flank, so you won't want to slot Backstabber, or if you're already at the 125% crit damage cap. In that case, you'd slot either Fighting Finesse or Biting Aura in that slot instead, depending on your specific situation. Or if you do find yourself under the crit cap for some reason, maybe in an unoptimized group setup, you could also slot Fighting Finesse in place of Thaumaturge to run both of the crit damage buffs. but usually with the stamina medium armor build, you won't need both of the crit damage CP nodes slotted. Now let's go through the gear. We already talked about the main set in this build, Drozakar's Claws, but let's go through the full loadout. For our monster set, we have a lot of good options here. Kjolnir is great for single target damage, but only one member of the group can wear it at a time because it works as a debuff on the target. Selene is also nice for single target damage. Stormfist and Veladreth are great AoE damage options if you are looking to add a little more cleave damage for a particular encounter, and Iceheart is a nice mix of damage and survivability since it adds in a shield that deals frost damage. Just keep in mind that if you lose the shield from taking damage, the frost damage stops as well until you trigger the effect again, so in scenarios where there is a lot of constant incoming damage, you might not actually get much DPS from the Iceheart set. For our body set, as we discussed earlier, we are using Drozakar's Claws. If you skip past it, the discussion over this set is in the overview section. For that front bar set, we are using either Pillar of Nirn or Arms of Reliquin. They're both really strong options. Reliquin does seem to do a little bit more single target damage, even though it is one less bleed to count towards Drozakar, but Pillar of Nirn is definitely very close behind and might be more practical for a lot of encounters since there is no building up and maintaining of stacks required like with Reliquin. And then on the back bar, we're going with the Maelstrom two-hander. If you don't have that yet, you can back bar whatever set you decided to do on your front bar, but that is one bleed that you'll be missing out on for this setup, so I definitely recommend to try and get that for this build. It doesn't need to be the perfected version either to make this work. And then if you do want to run a Mythic like the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt with this, it's a great option. You'll just drop your monster set and use a one-piece slime craw and then move your Drozakar leg piece to your shoulders. And the same principle would apply if you wanted to do a different Mythic like Ring of the Pale Order. You'll just move whatever piece you have on the ring to your body to make room for it. And if you wanted to do Drozakar's jewelry with this, that is fine too. You'll just have the 3 Pillar of Nirn or Reliquin pieces in whatever slots you want on the body. You'll just need to make sure that Drozakar is still the set that it always has 5 pieces active, and Pillar or Reliquin is the set that is front barred. For our traits, we want all Divines on the body, Bloodthirsty on the jewelry, Nirn-honed on the main hand and charged on the offhand for the daggers, and infused for the great sword on the back bar. For the enchantments, all stamina on the body, weapon damage on the jewelry, poison and flame on the front bar, and weapon damage on the back bar. I'd only recommend doing a frost offhand if your chilled uptime is really low, since wardens do get a unique 10% crit damage buff when enemies are chilled. Now this is separate from minor brittle, but even running in a group that might not have as much chilled, just your Winter's Revenge plus the charge trait on your offhand alone should be enough to at least get decent uptimes on the chilled status, enough to not warrant running a frost enchant on that offhand, but your situation may vary there. And then on our back bar, we will be doing a weapon damage enchantment. I will cover a couple of other sets here. I've been asked a lot about the Blood Drinker set with this as well, and it isn't bad, but definitely not as strong as Drozakar's with this build. So we typically end up somewhere around 40% or so of our damage being bleed damage. So multiply that by the 20% increase we get from Blood Drinker, and we end up roughly with an 8% or so total damage increase for our 5-piece bonus. Like I said, it isn't bad, but also isn't quite up there with some of our other options we could use. So maybe for a different build, it could work a little better, but you'll see a little better results with Drozakar with this build. And then if you want to use Kinra's as well, that's still a really great option. If you use all the bleeds that we're doing in this build, it does look like Drozakar is a little bit better, but if you find yourself with a different loadout, maybe dropping some bleeds here and there, you might get better results with Kinra's. So great set to have for both Magicka and Stamina DPS. Alright, now let's go through the skills. On the front bar, we are using Subterranean Assault, which is pretty much a must-have for Wardens, a really hard-hitting ability that we only have to cast 1 in every 6 abilities. And then the Cutting Dive ability is our main spammable, which gives us a secondary bleed on the side, Rending Slashes and Growing Swarm for 2 more bleed damage over time effects. And then Barbed Trap, which also gives us a bleed damage over time effect, plus Minor Force for 10% more crit damage. And then our ultimate will be Eternal Guardian. So you might ask why we are going with the Magicka morph. Well, since they have hybridized stats, mainly now our penetration being equal for both Magicka and stamina abilities, the Warden's Piercing Cold passive that gives a 10% increase to our magic damage abilities actually gives enough extra damage to the Magicka morph of the bear to where it deals more damage than the physical morph, even with the physical morph's increased damage that it is supposed to give. So pretty much the physical morph gives increased damage, but not enough to offset that 10% that you get from the piercing cold passive. So probably somewhat of a rework needs to be made with this in the future to get this skill caught up to date with the current state of the game. For our back bar, we're slotting Stampede, which is a really great AoE damage over time effect that will keep up our weapon damage enchantment that we have slotted on our back bar. Carve, which is a really strong AoE spammable and damage over time effect. So I'll get into this a bit in the rotation, but this now stacks up to 3 bleeds. So if you don't let the skill run out, once you have it stacked up 3 times, you actually will maintain the 3 bleeds. Like I said, I'll go through it in the rotation later, how we're going to keep that up without letting it drop off. Our next skill is Winter's Revenge for a nice magic accosting AoE that does good damage, helps with sustain, and adds more chilled uptime if needed. The next slot is our flex spot, so really whatever you need for a particular encounter can go here. If you don't need anything else, you can just slot Camo Hunter here for the passive weapon and spell damage increase. I do like Camo Hunter better than another animal companion ability because with it being on our back bar, having higher weapon damage is more important than having a % boost, since that higher weapon damage will carry over to our front bar with the Carve damage over time effect, since that will snapshot to your current stats when you cast it. And then finally, we have our Bull Netch here for an additional sustain tool and possibly for major brutality if you aren't running the potions that give it. And like I mentioned in the potion section earlier, you'll want to swap your Camo Hunter skill to the front bar and Barb Trap to your back bar if you're not running the potions that give brutality and savagery. Definitely try and run the good potions for harder group content though. And then one more thing to note about that back bar flex spot, you can slot whatever you need there. Maybe you need a heal like Vigor or something, but you could also slot Executioner there. It is a bit awkward to work with it being on your back bar, but it can still be really strong in the very last little bit of a fight, and it is generally only taking the spot of a passive buff anyway. So up to you there really, it doesn't make too much of a difference either way. Avail did use Executioner in the very last bit of his 124k parse, and it seemed to help push that last bit extremely fast. Alright, now let's go through some combat rotations. These will both be static versions. If you are looking for a dynamic rotation, which is a little more difficult to execute well overall, but does have a higher damage ceiling, I highly recommend checking out Inquisitor Mordrak's video where he used this same setup to get 129k DPS. He has some great tips listed in the description for maintaining the dynamic rotation. So instead of rehashing what he's already presented there, I thought I'd just give him a shout out instead and put the link down in the description below. Pain also has 125k parse using a dynamic rotation as well, which was done on Xbox using the in-game ability timer, so really impressive stuff there too. I will have links to both of their videos down in the description, so make sure to check those out. But not everyone wants to do dynamic rotations, I get that, so I wanted to cover a couple of static options here that can still get really good results. So this first one I'll go through is an easier version. It has a lower ceiling for damage, but it isn't dependent on paying attention to your enemy being off balance to maximize the Cutting Dive secondary bleed. So Cutting Dive has a special secondary function to where if the enemy is already off balance, it will add a bleed, and that bleed will stack with each additional time that you cast the ability. So off balance lasts for 7 seconds. Essentially, you can usually get in 6 Cutting Dive casts, so you stack your bleed up 6 times on itself. It's a really strong bleed if you can start that Cutting Dive spam right as off balance starts, but in a real combat scenario, that could be a little difficult to pay attention to, so that's why we wanted to present this easier version first that doesn't really track off balance and just kind of gets the extra bleed damage from the bird when it happens to randomly land. The second one I go through here will be prioritizing that off balance period though, so stick around for that if that's what you're looking for. So with that all out of the way, let's get into the rotation. So to open up, we'll just precast our Bull Netch and our Barbed Trap, and then we'll just have 2 alternating sections that we repeat throughout. Section A is Sub-Assault, Stampede, Carve, Cutting Dive, Rending Slashes, Growing Swarm. And then Section B is Sub-Assault, Winter's Revenge, Carve, and then 3 Cutting Dive casts. When we need to refresh our Barbed Trap for Minor Force, our Bull Netch for Sustain, or cast our Bear Ultimate, we'll just do that in place of one of the Cutting Dive casts whenever those abilities are ready. So one thing that is nice with this is that we will never drop our Carve stacks. It is overcast a bit more than is ideal, but you won't have to worry about accidentally missing the recast and letting the timer run out. and having to build it back up to the 3 bleed stacks. Another thing that I like with his layout here is that with Cutting Dive being present in both section A and B, even without really trying to pay attention to off balance phases, you'll generally still get some bleed stacks going to count for your Drozokar set. The downside is that with this rotation, the max you'll ever get is 3 bleeds at once from Cutting Dive instead of up to 6. Another downside is that it is a 12-second rotation, so some of your dots will have a little extra downtime in order to keep it static with your sub-assault casts every 6th skill. But yeah, not too difficult overall. May take a little practice to get down keeping up your barbed trap and bullnatch as they run out, but the core of the rotation is not too involved and just repeats back and forth with those 2 sections. So for that 111.8k DPS parse, Avail did use a non-mythic setup. He used Iceheart as his monster set, and this will be what I show later in the last section of the video. However, he did use a mythic Kilt setup for the advanced static parse that I'm about to cover. So since it wasn't a direct comparison, I didn't want people to look at 111k versus 124k and think that these rotations were necessarily that far apart. They were different gear setups. So I took this easier rotation, I put on the Kilt setup, and I wanted to take it for a spin and see how it did, and I got close to 115k with it, even being a little less experienced with Stam Warden than I am with some other classes. So I just wanted to show this one in addition to Avail's parse to compare directly between the easier and the advanced version that I'll show, apples to apples and all that. But yeah, the 111.8k one he did is the one that I will show at the end of the video. Alright, now let's go through his advanced static rotation that got him over 124k DPS. So a few caveats about this particular rotation. It prioritizes the Cutting Dive bleed that occurs when you cast Cutting Dive against an off-balance enemy, and this rotation does rely on fast weaving and perfect or near perfect off-balance uptimes. So the off-balance will need to be reapplied pretty much on cooldown, but I do have a few notes in this for those that might weave a little slower, or if you notice the off-balance came in a little later than it should have. To open up, we pre-buff with the Bullnatch, Sub-Assault, and our Barbed Trap, and then start our light attack weaving with Stampede, then immediately go into Cutting Dive spam for the off-balance bleed. After 5 casts of Cutting Dive, we recast Sub-Assault, and then move into the static section of the rotation that is repeated throughout. So we'll cast Stampede and Carve, then Rending and Growing Swarm, and then the next spot will be a Cutting Dive cast if your ultimate is not ready, or this is where you can cast your Bear ultimate if it is ready. And then we'll reapply our Sub-Assault, and then the same thing here with this next skill, but if you need to reapply your Bullnatch for the sustain, this is also the spot to do that in. And then we'll apply Winter's Revenge, Barbed Trap, Rending Slashes, Stampede, Carve, Growing Swarm, Sub-Assault, and then we should be hitting our off-balance period again right here, and we'll spam our Cutting Dive ability 6 times, and then recast Sub-Assault and start over. So a few things to note here. Avail does have a very good weaving speed, so if you are moving a little slower, you might have to reduce that 6 casts of Cutting Dive down to 5 casts to keep everything lined up, or maybe even down to 4 casts if you are really behind. If you look at that second line as well, the last skill there, it can be omitted if you are a little behind, so you just skip right to the Winter's Revenge cast after the Sub-Assault. So ideally, you'll be moving fast enough where that isn't needed, but that takes a lot of time and practice, so just putting the options there for those that might be going a little slower. This setup also has Carve recast at 10 seconds at one point in the rotation and 11 seconds at another point, so if you're weaving too slow, you might miss that reapplication of Carve on the 11-second timer since it will run out at 12 seconds. If this is the case, same sort of idea here, you'll want to omit one of those off-balance bird casts in order to make sure that both of those Carve recasts are at 10 seconds and you don't miss reapplying those before it runs out. Now you can control the off balance as well with your Cutting Dive ability by stepping back 7 meters or further from the target and casting Cutting Dive for that initial off balance, but you will move slightly outside of melee range, so ideally you'll have someone in your group that's already providing off balance. If that is not the case though, just throwing that out there as an option. Better to do that and miss one light attack than to not have the off balance going at all. And then finally, I touched on this earlier in the skills section, but Executioner can be spammed at the very end of the fight if you are running it in that flex spot on your back bar. In the 124k parse, you'll see Avail ends the fight with 7 casts of this in a row once the trial dummy hits about 1 million or 5% health left. This is an optional route though, it doesn't really make a big difference either way over just continuing the normal rotation and having a passive buff on that back bar. So to summarize, I definitely recommend trying the dynamic option I mentioned at the beginning of the rotation section from Inquisitor Mordrak's video. If you are comfortable with that and you really want to push this as far as you can go with it, it will allow you to adjust a little easier to different content, but I think this is a really good one to practice on with the dummy or on a more stationary boss fight, especially if your weaving is a little slow and you're trying to practice getting it up to more of those high-end speed levels. This will force you to keep it fast enough to really nail those off-balance sections without having to make too many split-second decisions like you would with the dynamic rotation. So you could just really focus on getting the speed there with this rotation, and then maybe once you're comfortable, move on to a more dynamic version. But for sure, dynamic should be the ultimate goal if you really want to keep pushing all the way as far as you can. Alright, that's going to do it for this guide. I hope you all enjoyed Avail's heavy bleeding build for the Deadlands DLC. Thank you so much for stopping by, and a big thank you to my current Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see how you can help support the channel through Patreon, I'll have a link in the description below. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, PvE Guild on PlayStation's EU server, Cougar's Bay in the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, BlakeWin816, and my wonderful wife. I'll close this one out with a couple of parses from Avail using the setup showcased. I will see y'all in the next one. Bye.